Hi and welcome to this flash lecture on Victorian culture and the machine. I want to start with some raw stats which illustrate the depth and the pace of transformation that Victorian Britain underwent in the 19th century in what historians have dubbed the Industrial Revolution. 10.5 million people lived in Britain in 1801. By 1851, that had nearly doubled to 20.8 million people. And what lies behind those figures in particular is the immense growth of the industrial cities of the north. Places like Manchester, which were relatively small settlements in the 18th century, were, by the middle of the Victorian period, huge seething masses of humanity working in cotton mills, which belched out smoke over the landscape. It was this great industrial metropolis. Pig iron, one of the key industrial commodities of the era. In the 1780s, Britain produced 69,000 tonnes, which sounds like a lot of pig iron, not so much when you compare it to the figure for the 1870s, 6.484 million tonnes. Railway track. The British were, of course, the first to have a railway system. In 1840, 2,390 kilometres of railway track in the country, and that represented 60% of all the world's railways. By 1900, 30,000 kilometres of track, a total transformation of transportation. From 1830 to 1860, the GDP of Great Britain, that is the output, the total value of goods and services produced, it doubled. From 1860 to the end of Queen Victoria's reign, it doubled again. And so there's no doubt that the society was living through an immense period of growth, of transformation. Here's the flip side. This is an account of factory conditions. Any man who has stood at 12 o'clock at the single narrow doorway which serves as the place of exit for the hands employed in the great cotton mills must acknowledge that an uglier set of men and women, of boys and girls, it would be impossible to congregate in a smaller compass. Their complexion is sallow and pallid, with a peculiar flatness of feature caused by the want of a proper quantity of adipose substance to cushion out the cheeks. Their stature is low, their limbs slender and playing badly and ungracefully. Great numbers of girls and women walking lamely or awkwardly with raised chests and spinal flexures. Factory labour is a species of work in some aspects singularly unfitted for children, cooped up in a heated atmosphere, debarred the necessary exercise, remaining in one position for a series of hours, one set or system of muscles alone called into activity. It cannot be wondered at that its effects are injurious to the physical growth of the child. And what's particularly interesting about that is that last sentence, that sense of physical degeneration, the body warped or reduced in the factory environment to stillness, to doing one repetitive, precise motion, just like a machine. And it's the mechanisation of the human body which is at stake here, I think. The machine was a site for anxiety. The Victorians were, there's no doubt, deeply ambivalent about this modernity that they were bringing into being, and the machine was one place where they were particularly anxious. They were particularly anxious that life itself was becoming mechanised. And I want to talk today just about three key Victorian thinkers who give diagnoses of a machine culture, but very different responses. And those are Matthew Arnold, John Ruskin and Karl Marx. We'll start with Arnold and his book Culture and Anarchy, or rather a set of essays called Culture and Anarchy. What Arnold diagnoses is that mechanisation is something that Victorian Britain is enthralled to. It pursues it, it wants more pig iron, it wants longer railway track, it wants more people, it wants more GDP. But it doesn't think what these things are for. It has mistaken a means for an end, and therefore it has lost any sense of a real end. Faith in machinery is our besetting danger, Arnold claims. What is freedom but machinery? What is population but machinery? What is coal but machinery? What are railroads but machinery? What is wealth but machinery? Now almost every voice in England is accustomed to speak of these things as if they were precious ends in themselves. Arnold says no, they are not ends in themselves. People are saying that coal is making Britain great, and if one loses the coal, then Britain's greatness disappears. For Arnold, that's totally wrong, because you need culture to ask the question, what is real greatness? What is the real end of our society? It's certainly not producing more and more coal. Now, behind this picture is two terms that Arnold introduces, Hellenism and Hebraism. Hebraism is to do with Jewish culture and its after effects. And he suggests these forces have been in play in every civilization. Hellenism is to do with reflection and to do with thought. Hebraism is to do with doing and action and duty. And he suggests that because Victorian Britain is in thrall to mechanisation, it has become overly Hebraic. It has become overly obsessed with action and doing, with making, and it has lost Hellenism. It does not reflect, it does not think. So unsurprisingly, he appeals to culture. What he wants to do is to re-inject culture, to re-inject reflection and thought back into the society, to rebalance it, to form a counterweight or a counterforce to mechanisation. And what Culture and Anarchy really is a great call and defence of higher culture. He suggests that culture looks beyond machinery. It is the passion for sweetness and light, and he wants to see some society that can look behind machinery, can look beyond machinery, and his answer therefore is to rebalance society with an appeal to high culture. So it's a very conservative programme, but it was very influential, in particular on things like the idea of the university, which is an institution for injecting, if you will, culture, Hellenism, back into a society that is threatened to become overbalanced on one side of things and only looking at terms of mechanism. Second writer I want to look at is John Ruskin. Now, where he's interesting is his comparison between modern production, modern modes of production, and older modes of production, like, in particular, the medieval craft guilds. Now, he suggests that you can teach a man to draw a straight line and to cut one, to strike a curved line and to carve it, and to copy and carve any number of given lines or forms with admirable speed and perfect precision. But if you do this, you make him into a machine, what Ruskin calls an animated tool. And you are put to a stern choice in this matter. You must either make a tool of the creature or a man of him. You cannot make both. Men were not intended to work with the accuracy of tools, to be precise and perfect in all their actions. If you will have that precision out of them and make their fingers measure degrees like cogwheels and their arms strike curves like compasses, you must unhumanise them. All the energy of their spirits must be given to make cogs and compasses of themselves. This is the natural, grotesque conclusion of this idea that the human body will itself become a machine. What Ruskin calls for is a return to craft, return to a mode of production which certainly isn't as precise and perfect as the making of things that are as involved in machine production, but in that imperfection is human, has creativity, has aesthetic value. And I think if you look across Ruskin's work, one of his main complaints, one of his main protests against the modern industrial age is an aesthetic one. What he hates more than anything else about modernity, about Victorian modernity, is its ugliness. And that's incredibly influential chain of thought. What else is really influential about Ruskin is his appeal back to craft, his nostalgia for the medieval. Medievalism, ironically, was a deeply rooted instinct for a Victorian modern culture. We see it in things like the paintings of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And Ruskin, who says we need to go back to a form of production which is more human, which is more aesthetic, which has an individual link between the creator and the created object, which has some beauty. That's immensely influential on things like William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. In that sense, Ruskin is a conservative. He's nostalgic. And whilst there is some nostalgia for pre-industrial production in the final thinker I want to look at, Karl Marx, Marx ends up in a very different place. Now, Capital is an analysis of many things, but is full of accounts of British industrial production, very similar to that I read out at the very beginning of this micro-lecture. But it's not just the empirical conditions in factories that Marx is protesting. He has a greater point of view behind it. He has a structural issue to concern him. And that is the very nature of capitalism. Now, for Marx, put very briefly, capitalism is when people who own the means of production get workers to work with those means of production to make things. The capitalist then takes those things away, sells them on the market, pays the workers a relatively small wage, as small as possible, and then whatever's left over he takes for himself. So capitalism is, Marx describes it as, a kind of vampirism. It's an extraction of what Marxists call surplus value from the working class. Here's a bunch of people, the proletariat, the working class, doing all the producing. What do they get? Well, they don't get to sell what they produce, they just get a living wage, a subsistence wage. The people who get the value, the profit, are the capitalists, the people who have hired them, the people who own the factories, the workshops, whatever it may be. They extract surplus value from the working class. And therefore Marx sees society as a kind of struggle between the mass of the proletariat, of the workers, and the capitalists who come along and employ them and extract this value. Now, where the factory system is important for Marxism is it's the very apex, it's the quintessence of this system of extraction and exploitation. In Marxist terms, the factories are machines which are incredibly efficient at extracting surplus value from the working class. They bind workers to the factory. One key thing about the division of labour in a factory is that each worker only creates a small part of the thing. He might make a tiny pin that goes into something, or a woman might make a rivet, whatever. They don't make a whole object, and because of this they don't have the skill that a craftsman would have. They can't be a weaver, for example. They can't go and set up their own weaving workshop and sell clothes. All they can do is make a rivet, and therefore they have to work in the factory. They must work in the factory. They almost become assimilated or absorbed into the mechanised process, which is the factory system. And therefore Marx says that manufacture is the first system to provide the materials and impetus for an industrial pathology. And because workers are kind of absorbed into this mechanical process and they can't exist outside it, they don't have any other skills, they don't have any other choice, they share in the acceleration and the pace of industrial production. As machines become more extensive and more expansive, the workers have to work more cheaply, they work longer hours, they work more intensely, they work faster. And where this is important in turn for Marx is that it shows capitalism as what it really is, which is the exploitation of the labourers by the capitalists. The factory system, as I say, is a kind of machine for extracting surplus value. Now, this is interesting because Marx does not call, like Ruskin does, to go back to some kind of nostalgic craft production. But what he does see in the factory system is a moment when capitalism is pushing itself on towards crisis. Because the exploitation between capitalists and proletariat is so naked, so obvious, so unconcealed in the factory and in the mechanism of the factory, he predicts that inevitably capitalism will be resisted. Here is part of Capital. The factory system destroys both the ancient and the transitional forms behind which the dominion of capital is still partially hidden, and replaces them with a dominion which is direct and unconcealed. But by doing this, it also generalises the direct struggle against its rule. By maturing the material conditions and the social combination of the process of production, it matures the contradictions and the antagonisms of the capitalist form of that process, chiefly that antagonism between the owners of the factory and the people who are forced or have no choice but to work in those factories, and thereby ripens both the elements for forming a new society and the forces tending towards the overthrow of the new one. And the factory, or the factory system, is a crucial site where this antagonism is suddenly played out in plain view. When you look at a factory and you see the conditions of the workers and you see the narrowness of their existence, Marx predicts this is capitalism as exploitation, as a form of violence, as a form of vampirism in its most obvious and unconcealed form. And once that has been rendered visible, he predicts history must push on towards the end of capitalism. Now, of course, as many of you all know, Marx's predictions did not exactly come true, but what's interesting is that Marx provides a certain impetus, which is a very different one to, say, Ruskin. Because there's no nostalgia, it's future orientated, it's looking forward to a reorganisation of the social forces. And so, whilst Arnold and Ruskin and Marx are all diagnosing similar problems with the dehumanising elements of machine culture, the kind of pathology around the machine, they come up with such radically different responses. From Marx's revolutionary communism to Arnold's appeal to high culture and Hellenism, they couldn't be further away, and yet they're responding to the same problem. That's where I want to end, really. The Victorians understood that they lived in a society of the machine. And they saw great potential, of course, in mechanisation and in the conditions for living, the transformed conditions that mechanisation and the Industrial Revolution brought about. We might look at things like the SS Great Eastern, this enormous ship made by Brunel. It would be 40 years before anyone made a ship as long, 40 years before anyone made a ship as heavy as this. This made out of wrought iron, incredible. Or something like the 1851 Great Exhibition, this enormous iron and glass industrially produced building in which things from all over the empire and all the great technologies of Britain were displayed for the public to come and see them. It was nearly a mile long, it had trees inside it. These are images of the triumph of Victorian industrialism. But as I've just shown, there was also great anxiety. And I think that makes the Victorians quintessentially modern. If we can define modernism perhaps as an acute awareness of being modern, of living on the leading edge of history, and I think that's a pretty good definition of modernism, then although we think of literary modernism, of artistic modernism as beginning in the 20th century, there is no doubt the Victorians were moderns, and one key place where they confronted their own modernity was the machine. Thank you very much.